All right, thank you. One of the things that the fossil record can give us insight into, which we can't get only from studying living organisms, is major evolutionary transitions, so the origins of entirely new body plans or behaviors. So things like, for instance, the origin of terrestrial tetrapods from fishes, or the evolution of whales from land-living mammals, or the evolution of birds, flying animals, from carnivorous theropod dinosaurs. And this is the transition that I'm going to speak about today. And I'm going to talk about some work that I did for my PhD, and then work that we're continuing to do, my new group in Edinburgh, work that is largely in collaboration with Graeme Lloyd here in the front row, and some other colleagues. So over the past decade or so, the dinosaur-bird transition has emerged as a textbook example of a major evolutionary transformation in the fossil record. And this is largely for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have an exceptional fossil record of birds and their closest relatives among dinosaurs. Something like 50 new species of these kinds of animals have been found over the last few decades. A lot of them from the very famous feathered dinosaur beds in China, but also from all over the world. And we just don't have a fossil record like this when it comes to studying the origin of animals or the origin of insects or many other major transitions. Secondly, there's been a vast amount of phylogenetic work on early birds and their close relatives among dinosaurs. And this is very important, as we'll see, because we need a phylogeny to do any type of quantitative macroevolutionary work. So we have a pretty good idea of where birds fit in the family tree of dinosaurs. They're members of a subgroup of theropods called the coelurosaurs. This is a group that includes about 150 Mesozoic species, a very diverse group, ranging from colossal predators like T-Rex, to very bizarre plant-eating theropods like therizinosaurs, to very bird-like dinosaurs like velociraptor, and then, of course, to birds themselves. And much of this understanding of where birds fit is due to a long-term project called the Theropod Working Group project that's been led by Mark Norell at the American Museum in New York. And it's included a lot of Mark's colleagues and his postdocs and his students like me. So my PhD was part of this project that's been going on now for about 20 years. And because of the work that the Theropod Working Group has done, as well as many, many other people from all over the world that are interested in the dinosaur-bird transition, we know quite a bit about the phylogeny of the things that are the very closest relatives of birds. There's still, of course, disagreements, but it's widely recognized that dinosaurs like dromaeosaurs, the velociraptor-type dinosaurs, or troodonids, oviraptorosaurs, these are the very closest relatives of birds. And this is because the Theropod Working Group, as well as other groups, has basically seen all of the specimens. They've coded all of these things. They're implemented in many of the data sets. But there has been much less work on the phylogeny of more basal coelurosaurs. So things like tyrannosauroids, ornithomimosaurs, the ostrich-mimic dinosaurs, compsognathids, very small, sleek, predatory dinosaurs. These things have yet to be fully implemented into the Theropod Working Group study. And with other groups that are working on theropod phylogeny, there's a whole lot of disagreement when it comes to the relationships of these basal coelurosaurs. And this is just a handful of recent studies. The basal taxa are shown in red, and I think just glancing at this, you can see there's hardly any consensus. And so there are several major questions then about coelurosaur phylogeny that we don't currently have any good answers for. So, for instance, what's the most basal coelurosaur subgroup? Compsognathids, those small, slender, fast-running basal coelurosaurs, are they actually a clade, or are they just a polyphyletic array of coelurosaurs that kind of look like each other? The ostrich-mimic dinosaurs, very bizarre, some of the most bizarre dinosaurs of all. Where do they fit? How did they evolve their characteristic body plan? And tyrannosaurs, some really interesting questions about tyrannosaurs. Over the last decade, there have been several new discoveries of very old Jurassic, early Cretaceous theropods, things that are just about the size of us, things called Dilong, Guanlong, a couple others that are thought to be early tyrannosaurs, evolutionary precursors of those colossal ones from the very latest Cretaceous. So are they actually early members of that group? So questions like this, because they're still unanswered, it means that we really don't have a good species-level phylogeny of coelurosaurs, and that in turn hinders our ability to do the types of quantitative macroevolutionary studies that we might want to do to better understand that transition between dinosaurs and birds. So for my PhD work, I attempted to rectify this by starting off with the most recent version of that Theropod Working Group study that was published last year by Alan Turner and Mark Norell and Pete McAvicky. That study largely focused on those very closest relatives of birds, the dromaeosaurs, those types of dinosaurs. And to that, we added a bunch of new data, about 400 new characters, 40 new taxa. And the result is, for the first time, a Theropod Working Group study properly is a full coelurosaur analysis, covering almost really the entire clade, almost a species-level phylogeny of the group. Just a few taxa here and there missing for various reasons, because they're too fragmentary or we couldn't see them. But for the most part, almost total coverage. We analyzed it, traditional ways of analyzing these data sets in TNT. I won't go into detail with that. I won't say a whole lot about the phylogeny, but this is the strict consensus that we get with support values next to the nodes. The relationships of the most bird-like things and of early birds, very similar to what's been published previously by the Theropod Working Group. Not really much to say in a quick talk on that, but instead I'll just say a few things about basal coelurosaurs and what this study says about some of those big questions about the basal taxa. So all of the major coelurosaur subgroups are found to be monophyletic. That includes compsognathids. Tyrannosauroids are the most basal major subclade, and those human-sized Jurassic and Cretaceous things, Dilong, Guanlong, others, are found to be early members of the Tyrannosaur group here. Now, there still are some areas, of course, of uncertainty, a couple of problematic polytomies. Won't go into too much detail here, but even with the addition of a lot of new data, homoplasy is still a real problem. We've yet to break through that in certain parts of the phylogeny. But anyway, so we have a relatively complete phylogeny of coelurosaurs. May be interesting for those of us that study dinosaurs, but I think what's more interesting is to now use that phylogeny to better understand that dinosaur-bird transition, that textbook example of the evolution of a major new clade and body plan. And when you have a phylogeny, you have a big data set of anatomical characters, you can do a whole lot of stuff with them. But what I'm going to talk about today are two things that Graeme and I and our colleagues have been working on, looking at rates of anatomical evolution across that transition and looking at morphospace occupation, so some of the things we've seen earlier in this session. So looking first at rates, one question that we might be interested in is that given a phylogeny, can we identify parts of that tree, either individual branches or entire clades, that have significantly faster or slower rates of evolution than the rest of the tree? And if we can do that with theropods, that can give insight into, for example, whether or not the origin of birds was associated with a huge uptick in the pace of evolution. So one way we can test this is using a suite of methods that Graeme and Steve Wang and I published last year, largely developed by Graeme, that where we optimize characters onto the phylogeny. We can calculate a rate of change per branch for each branch of the tree, taking into account missing data. And then we can use likelihood statistics to assess rate heterogeneity on the tree. Now, one of the issues with these types of studies is uncertainty in branch durations. There's always a problem with using phylogenies for large macroevolutionary studies. The way that we date the tree is by taking the dates of the terminal taxa and then by ghost range extensions, those cascade throughout the tree to date all of the branches. But terminal taxa very rarely are known from a single date, unless they happen to be preserved in an ash or something like that. So usually it's a range of ages. So what we do essentially is a randomization approach where we calculate rates many times using a range of ages. So that means that in these next plots, I'm going to show each branch or clade has a pie chart next to it, and that's just the proportion of those runs when that clade is significantly high or low or neither. And so where you see a lot of red on these next two slides is clades that have very high rates of change. So if we look at individual branches, we see a lot of red in tyrannosaurs, we see a lot of red, high rates in birds, and also on the sequence of internal branches leading towards birds. And we see a similar pattern when we look at entire clades, a whole sea of red in tyrannosaurs, and then also in birds. So an interesting pattern there. Tyrannosaurs are the only major coelurosaur subgroup that evolved huge size. There are other random coelurosaurs here and there that did it. Of course, many other dinosaurs did it, but tyrannosaurs are the only one among coelurosaurs. So maybe this is indicating that at least some dinosaurs evolved gigantic proportions by accelerating rates of anatomical evolution. And that'll be something, of course, it'll be interesting to test with other dinosaur groups that got big. And then birds, the other major group showing fast rates. The group of coelurosaurs that have evolved this completely different way of life. So maybe this is indicating, at least in this case, that major transitions are also associated with increased rates of anatomical evolution. And this gets at a big issue in the evolutionary biology literature now, this question of whether or not the origin of major groups is associated with bursts of character evolution. And some studies say yes, and some say no, and some methods say yes, and others say no. But at least with coelurosaurs, with the methods we use, it seems to be yes, a great burst of character evolution associated with the origin of birds. So that's rates. We can also look at morphological disparity, basically the overall morphological variability of birds and theropods, forgetting about how fast or slow they're changing features of their skeleton. And we saw earlier about morphospaces. Basically, we do the same thing here. We use our anatomical character data set to construct a morphospace with multivariate analysis. And we can do a lot with that, but just one thing that we can do here that I'll talk about is then use the positions of taxa in morphospace to test whether or not there is any quantitative distinction between birds and their very closest relatives. All right, so when we do that, these are the first two axes. And there does seem to be over here a cluster of birds and a couple other clusters, but really that distinction is only present on the first axis. It's not present on the second axis, and that first axis is only one of about 100 that the analysis returns. And if we look, for instance, at the second versus the third axis, there's no pattern anymore, and that's true of every subsequent axis. But we don't just have to eyeball it, we can run statistical tests, and when we do a permutation test to compare group means, we find no significant separation between birds and their very closest relatives. There's no great jump in morphospace between non-birds and birds. And I think really what that is just a statistical reinforcement of a pattern that's become very clear over the past few decades, and that is that many features unique to birds among living animals, feathers and wishbones and air sacs and all of these things, didn't first evolve in birds, didn't first evolve in concert with the origin of flight, but were assembled piecemeal over tens of millions of years of theropod dinosaur evolution. So, and I think what that means then is that if we were standing around in the Mesozoic and we saw animals like this, we would make no distinction between them and birds. These are not birds. These animals, as far as we know, could not fly. This is Velociraptor, this is Oviraptor, but for all intents and purposes, they are birds. The dinosaur-bird transition is really a gradational one. So then, to sum up then, how do we rectify this finding of high rates of evolution in early birds with this finding that they're not quantitatively distinct in their overall anatomy from their closest relatives? Well, those high rates are not due, again, to a big jump in morphospace. No big jump between non-birds and birds. Instead, that avian body plan was assembled gradually over tens of millions of years of dinosaur evolution. But once that body plan was assembled, it seems like birds started to go crazy. They moved all around their small area of morphospace, and that's why there's high rates. So it's like maybe something was unlocked once that body plan came together. So maybe this is a more general way that major transitions occur. Of course, something that we'll have to keep testing with other major transitions in the fossil record. All right, so with that, I thank you, and if we have time for questions, I'll take them, or if not, catch me afterwards.
Thanks.